Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the dense pine forests of the Slana River just north of the Wrangel St. Elias National Park and Preserve in Alaska. Along the river is a broad valley in which the river winds and creates a vibrant riparian zone that allows beaver, moose, wolves, and bears to thrive. Though this area is crisscrossed by a few roads and dotted by roadhouses and tiny towns, it is remote. Stepping off of the established travel route places you in the middle of virtually uninterrupted forests and wetlands. In the early 20th century, only the toughest and most independent of souls would call this place home. On August 29th of 1949, an immigrant from Denmark named Knut Peterson spent 26 years of his life mining and prospecting the waters of the Slana River system for gold and uranium. That day he drove his truck down the road to his friend's cabin. Ole Hougland was a trusted mining companion, and Knut was planning on visiting and asking his friend to go mining with him up the Big Tok River to the north. Knut parked his truck on the gravel highway and started walking down the trail to Ole's place. He had made this trip countless times and never had an incident that he couldn't handle. He hadn't brought his rifle and planned to stay the night at his friend's house before returning in the morning. After discussing the prospecting trip, Ole let Knut know that he simply couldn't go, as he had too much work to do. As Ole began his chores, Knut started the return hike to the highway, and his vehicle parked there. Knut returned on the trail, which was only a few yards from the river it followed. He was excited to get back and start preparing his equipment for his trip. He was a little over a quarter of a mile from Ole's cabin when he was terrified by a deafening roar from the willows behind him. For a moment he was paralyzed by fear, but soon turned in the direction the roar had come from. He was mortified at the sight of an 800-pound, enraged brown bear speeding toward him, eyes focused on him. The giant bear was infuriated and growled and snarled as it closed in on the petrified miner. Knut had seen bears run plenty of times, but the speed of this gargantuan bruin amazed him and relayed the fury of the bear. Knut knew that he couldn't outrun the bear, but hoped that he could jump into the river right next to him. He quickly surmised a plan to hold his breath as long as he could as the muddy river waters hid his escape downstream back toward Ole's cabin. He could swim the rest of the way and the bear would soon forget about him. But that plan was far too ambitious. The bear caught him only a few steps into his escape. The brown bear slapped him on his left shoulder, knocking him flat onto his face in the gravel. The bear sank its 2-inch-long canines into Knut's left arm and bit it to the bone. The bite nearly severed his arm and rendered it useless in his defense. Knut flipped onto his back to try to kick the bear, but the beast immediately tried locking its jaws onto his face before he could react. Knut hollered as loudly as he could for Ole and slapped the bear across the nose with his right hand in a futile attempt to defend himself. The bear was so fast that it crunched onto his right hand and wrist before Knut could even pull his hand back. The bear then focused its attack on his right thigh and bit it to the bone as well. The bear's teeth tore and ripped his thigh like a knife through hot butter. It chewed on his thigh while holding him down with its left paw positioned on his gut, while the man yelled for his friend to help him. The bear next slapped Knut's left calf and ripped it wide open with a single swipe. It then flipped him over by digging its claws into his back and ribs, gashing flesh and skin alike. Knut tried to belly crawl into some nearby alder, but the bear slashed him on the back of his head, severing a 3-inch patch of his scalp completely. The bear then bit into his neck, and Knut could feel his vision fading as his air and blood supply to his brain was pinched by the pressure of the bite. The bite increased the blood pressure in his head so much that he could feel it. The next thing Knut could remember seeing was the bear's enormous mouth, as it again focused on his head. The bear clamped onto the lower half of his face and crushed his jawbone, knocking 4 teeth out with a piece of jawbone. It broke the upper plate of his dentures in 2. The bite severed his nose and upper lip as well. The bear threw an absolute fit on the man, grunting and growling and huffing in rage for the better part of a minute. Then it disappeared. The silence was such a contrast to the noise of the attack that Knut was unsure if he was still alive. He sat there for a short time trying to gather the depth of what had just happened. He inventoried his wounds as best he could and was covered from head to toe in his own blood. His clothes were tattered, and the only section intact was his belt line and waist of his pants. All of his other clothes were torn from him during the attack. He was covered with cuts and gashes, and his right wrist was obviously broken. The meat of his right thigh was completely separated from his leg, but still scantily attached. His left bicep muscle was torn loose from his arm and rolled up toward his elbow. His face was an utter mess, and his windpipe was exposed from the bite to his neck. He wasn't sure if it was even possible to get back to Ole's cabin, and tried to crawl initially, but his broken wrist made it impossible. He struggled to his feet, but couldn't walk with his right thigh so severely damaged, so he sort of hopped on his left leg as best he could. As he staggered through the brush, his blood seeped from his face into his windpipe, causing him to choke and cough. He bent over trying to clear his airway of blood, but the blood from his face then flowed into his eyes, temporarily blinding him. He didn't care if the bear was following him or not, as if there was a subsequent attack, he knew he would not survive it. His best bet was to push on toward Ole's. As he approached Ole, he could see and hear his friend sharpening tools on a small grinder. He didn't want to startle Ole, but he couldn't speak, so he let out a grunt, which was drowned out by the grinder. He grunted even louder, and Ole turned around, and his expression told Knut everything he needed to know. Ole later would indicate that he only recognized Knut's eyes, as nothing else was familiar. As Ole stared at Knut, he muttered, "Oh, Christ, Knut, what happened? A bear?" Knut nodded his head and pointed to the cabin. His friend helped him inside and prepped a mattress for him to lay on. Knut tried to say goodbye to his friend, but couldn't utter any intelligible words due to the injuries to his face. Knut comforted his friend, grabbed his rifle, and left for help. Ole ran the mile to his truck on the highway and made it the 4 miles to the Alaska Road Commission camp within 17 minutes. Given that he was over 60 years old, he made amazing time. At the camp, the authorities were notified and a small rescue crew was assembled to save Knut's life. Back at the cabin, Knut stood to his feet and looked in the mirror. His face was sloughed over to the side, and he knew this was something that he wasn't sure he would ever recover from. He laid back on the mattress, but started to get cold from shock. He decided to light a fire in the wood stove, but the blood from his injuries continually extinguished the flame. He was so distorted he couldn't even smoke a cigarette. He tried to write a will and testament on a calendar, leaving everything to his brother Ole. Knut soon heard the voices of his rescuers outside the cabin. The men carried him on the mattress and put him in a boat to take him downstream closer to a road. The men carried him from the craft to a vehicle, and he used his hands to hold his face together enough to ask them if their efforts were even worth it. They reassured him that he would survive. An army doctor administered morphine just before they loaded him into a plane to fly the World War I veteran to a military hospital on Elmendorf Military Base in Anchorage. The men returned to the scene and found Knut's severed scalp, but it was beyond saving. 2 soldiers donated blood for Knut, and surgeons worked for several hours trying to patch him back together. The surgeons had to discard the portion of his thigh muscle that was torn loose, as it could not be salvaged. Dirt, pine needles, and bits of clothing were removed from his injuries before they sutured them shut with 418 stitches. Despite a grim prognosis, Knut regained the use of his right arm and his leg within about 4 years. He stayed in the hospital for 3 months, and his missing scalp grew a thin layer of scar tissue over it in about 2 years. It was frail and would be ripped open easily, but that was better than having an exposed skull. Knut was filled with a vengeance toward bears after that, and recommended that people shoot any bear that shows up around their cabin. The bear was a huge, healthy bear of undetermined sex, and the presence of cubs was never confirmed. The bear was not shot and remained unharmed to the best of the research I uncovered.